Hi, I'm Paul J. Welcome to theAnalysis.news. As you can see, I have a kind of screwy setup. I'm not in my studio. I'm out visiting with Dan Ellsberg in California, but I'll do my best to make this work. I'll be back in just a few seconds. We're going to talk to a Ukrainian member of the socialist left in Ukraine about the current situation and ask him some of the questions people have been asking here in North America and around the world. Be back in just a few seconds. The considerations when one talks about the Russian invasion of Ukraine are different. If you're in Ukraine and you're dealing with an aggressive invader, or you're in North America where you're facing, or the United States in particular, where you're facing the center of the empire, which has its finger on everything, although perhaps not as much as, or in control of as much as they would like to be, or as some of the American left and others think they are. But we're going to get to that in just a bit. But first, we're going to talk with our guest about what the conditions are now in Ukraine, and then we'll get into some of the other questions. So now joining us from Western Ukraine, I'm not going to say what city it is, just out of his own safety concerns, is Denis Pilash. He's a political scientist, a historian, a translator. He's an activist of the Ukrainian Democratic Socialist Organization, the Social Movement, a member of the Commons, a journal of social criticism. He's on the editorial board, and he's co-author of the book Leva Europa, the Left Europe. Thanks very much for joining us, Denis.
Thank you for inviting.
So you're in Western Ukraine, which you've told me is relatively safer than certainly most of the rest of Ukraine. But first of all, what's it like for you? What are you doing day to day? And then tell us a little bit about what you know of what's happening in the rest of the country.
Now we are deeply into the war, and it has affected tens of millions of lives. So thousands of civilians have been killed, and millions have had to relocate. Many of them have already crossed the border with Poland, Slovak Republic, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, and so on. But many more millions are relocating inside Ukraine to safer places. And actually, I would say that now we have an existential horror when you are thinking about the plight of those people who are now under the shelling and the airstrikes in Kyiv, in Kharkiv, in smaller cities, towns, and villages in the eastern, northern, and southern parts of Ukraine. So actually, many people, they couldn't leave their homes, they couldn't leave their elder relatives, they couldn't leave their relatives with disabilities, they couldn't leave their pets, and actually, in some places, situation is really dire. So some of the towns have been destroyed almost completely, like Volnovakha in Donbas and Shastya, and some of Kiev suburbs like Irpin, Hostomel, and Bucha. The city of Mariupol is now besieged, and there is certain humanitarian disaster there, and there are estimates that thousands of civilians probably have perished in this catastrophe. So as for me, the first days were really horrific, really terrible when you tried just to track where your friends are and whether all of them are in safety, and then you are starting to get some news that someone whom you used to know is killed. For instance, an anarchist guy in Kharkiv and a physicist near Kyiv. So now I'm in this one of the western cities of Ukraine where we have relatively less air alerts and you don't live in a constant fear of being attacked and bombed, but you still feel there is a war going on, and you have thousands of refugees fleeing to the west, and also you have an influx of humanitarian aid coming pouring through the city. So now I'm trying to volunteer at the local university to help to transport and disseminate this aid for the refugees, for the relocated persons, for the people near the front line, and also to the people who in one way or another are trying to resist. So actually we had more than hundreds of thousands of people who enlisted in this voluntary territorial self-defense units, and you have actually millions of essential workers and volunteers, like humanitarian volunteers, people who are trying to aid others who try to escape and who try just to survive. And actually, we have to say a huge respect to, especially for the healthcare workers who are working relentlessly to save human lives, and for the transportation workers. Actually, again, they are also risking their lives. Some of them have been killed, but for instance, the employees of the state-run railroad companies, they managed to relocate, to evacuate an enormous number of peoples, and so they are one of the biggest heroes of this situation. And again, you have like lots and lots of these people who are working class people who are usually not so visible as the frontline people essential for the resistance and for survival, but they are the ones who keep the things running.
So what is the role of the left, the workers' movement, trade unions? What role are they playing in the context of this invasion? And also, what about this law that was just passed by the Ukrainian government outlawing various parties, including some left socialist parties? And was your party affected at all?
I would start probably with the general context. So, like in Ukraine, like almost everywhere in Eastern and Central Europe, the so-called post-socialist states, well, you have a rather poor situation for the left, the progressive forces, and the labor movement. Lots of things that are playing into this situation, like starting with this really wild capitalism that was unleashed in the 90s, and the market reforms that led to impoverishment of people and to dismantling social safety nets. But also, of course, there is part of this comes from the discreditation of the leftist and socialist and communist ideas by the experience of Stalinism and like the hunger, the repressions, and so on. So obviously, it's not quite a not something that is boosting so much a progressive alternative here. So actually in Central and Eastern Europe, you have just several maybe countries where the new left parties have been prominent, like Levica in Slovenia or Razem in Poland. But in the rest of these places, usually you have full conditions for the democratic left. So this was the situation for Ukraine as well. And well, our group called Социальный рух, the social movement, it was leftist organization that was organized to bring together people from trade unions, from student movement, from feminist movement, from ecological movement, from other social movements, and to try to articulate democratic socialist agenda, an anti-capitalist agenda, to constitute like a real grassroots political subject that would voice for the working class people. And we felt the necessity for this after we experienced in Ukraine, there was a number of mass protests, like usually called Maidans, due to like the biggest square in Kiev. Well, actually, they were joined. They were really popular movements joined by a huge number of people, but these people were driven by the same problems that are usually causing people to protest throughout the world. So starting with poverty, inequality, lack of political representation, police brutality, and so on. But every time, the only result was probably some change of the top politicians, some probably change of geopolitical orientations, but never the change of the system. That is a system of peripheral oligarchic capitalism that flourishes in Ukraine and elsewhere in our region. So we felt that we need to propose this kind of alternative and to challenge the this oligarchic system that is actually all mainstream political parties are rooted in these oligarchic financial and industrial groups, and they are representing like them. So that was the reason why our group then called the Left Opposition, then the Assembly for Social Revolution, and ultimately we created this NGO social movement with a perspective to become a political party. But like in Ukraine, we have probably more than 200, maybe 300 registered political parties, but they are no more than some kind of electoral vehicles that are sometimes bought by some capitalist actors and then resold after the elections. So they lack any convenient any kind of like political ideology and philosophy and so on, and they don't really represent some social groups besides, of course, the capital that runs them. So this was the prerequisites for the establishment of our group, and we are trying to now, in these conditions, we are trying to do the best to probably both help the people in need and also to prevent some cuts of social and labor rights. Of course, in any situation, any government in this operating in this neoliberal shock doctrine, they will grab the opportunity to somehow cut the rights for the majority, especially the social and economic rights, and somehow to benefit the ruling class. So it was again the same now here. We have some neoliberal members of parliament who tried to, and actually passed a law that is still awaiting for the signature by president, and so we are calling veto it, a law that it makes easier to sack workers, and it's quite cynical in the situation when workers are the backbone of the Ukrainian resistance today. So again, they are thinking in this purely, of course, categories of what's good for the business, not what's good for the workers. So then we have the situation with the trade unions in Ukraine. Again, it's like elsewhere in the region, it's also a bit complicated. So we have two big trade union entities. So the Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine and the Confederation of Free Trade Unions of Ukraine. The first one is a continuation of the official pro-governmental old Soviet Unions, and many cases it was perceived as really an ally of the management and something that's not representing its membership at all. The second one emerged from the big miners movement in the end of the 80s. So it was one of these reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the workers were protesting actually due to they had economic demands, and they felt that the system that calls itself working class is actually run by bureaucracy, not by the people. So they emerged as independent unions, and they are smaller. But now we had the situation when in both these entities you could find both some bureaucrats aligning with management. At the same time, you can see like really militant branches, and in our organization we have organizers and people who are active in both this federation and confederation, the people who work with construction workers, with crane workers, with miners, this independent miners union, especially in the city of Kryvyi Rih. That's kind of industrial heart of Ukraine, is in the center of Ukraine. It's extremely long city along ore mines and ore refineries. Interestingly enough, it's also the birthplace of the current president Zelenskyy. Many of these people are now involved in all kinds of activities, both linked to some kind. Many actually workers, they enlisted for the military resistance, but many are doing their jobs to keep the things going. Now again we try to gain more international attention and solidarity for especially for the plight of Ukrainian workers in the situation of war, and to also find international solidarity for the demands that would benefit the working class in Ukraine, like starting from obvious one that we need to stop the war and to withdraw all Russian forces from Ukrainian territory, and continuing with the specific ones that are needed to recover Ukraine after this ravaging war. So we need to cancel the Ukrainian external debt and get the country out of this vicious circle of debt of the IMF austerity policies and so on. We need to again probably to confiscate as much assets and property and of oligarchs, I think both Russian and Ukrainian, because again this war it has shown that the class war has no ending and no truth, even in situation when you have like an international war. You could see the Ukrainian oligarchs who were fleeing from the country prior to the invasion, and who tried to to rob the people in a way, to make them pay for the damage caused by the war. And of course, you have the Russian ruling class that again was robbing its own people, other people throughout the post-Soviet space, and who were concentrating their enormous wealth and doing it off with tax havens, and then buying property in London and the Netherlands and Switzerland, and like having being actually an organic part of the global ruling elite. Of course, Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs are like the same that any other capitalist, so they do the same thing, and they are the same way criminal. Though in our case, they are usually also criminal in direct sense, because it was how this primitive accumulation of capital in the 90s was conducted. So with criminal activities, literally. Yeah. So and to turn all this for the reconstruction of the economy, of the infrastructure, for rebuilding the apartments, and providing help for the people who were gone out by this war. So probably we'll also go back to this specific demands, but I will also comment on the question about this decree that was banning a dozen of political parties. So yeah, it was about temporary stopping of the activity of several political parties that are deemed as pro-Russian. So two of them are like the biggest pro-Russian parties. One of them is one of the main oligarchic parties in Ukraine. Another one is a personalist party of a YouTube blogger who, like many YouTube bloggers in this part of the world, really made his name with lots of hate speech and pitting people against each other. But really, there is also a number of parties that have the word socialist or something like that in their names. Well, the majority of them don't even exist actually. So they are some virtual entities. For instance, once well known and once well, it was really respected, the Socialist Party of Ukraine. The 90s, it emerged as some kind of hope for the democratic left here, and it was a principled opposition against the regime of President Kuchma, who was the architect of this Ukrainian oligarchic capitalism, and the Socialist Party was one of the main forces behind the protests against it. But then it started to sell off to different groups of local bourgeoisie, either pro-Western or pro-Russian, and so it became very discredited. And at some point, it was hijacked by very strange people. The last of them was it's a quite curious case. A guy who started as a far-right activist. And he was an aide and advisor to Minister Avakov, the Minister of Interior, who was again deemed to be the patron of the Ukrainian far right. And like this very brutish guy from the police, who was notorious for his remarks against I don't know, separatists, and against he was promising to destroy, kill drug addicts and so on, with his rhetorics. Yes. And then at some point he became one of the most pro-Russian and pro-Putin member of parliament. And now he is like outside the country and cheerleading for the Russian invasion. So this guy, he actually, with the support of the Minister of Interior, he actually hijacked the party and threw out all the remaining real activists from there. So it's really you can say that these parties weren't actually really left. For instance, like the Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine, it was more about being some kind of right-wing populist. It was deeply into some conspiracy theories about how the I don't know, some plots against the Orthodox Christian civilization and our values and so on. But they were of no significance, and they aren't somehow being some big obstacles for the I know, for the existence of Ukraine. So I think that this decision, it was not just like when these facts unnecessary and stupid, but it was also setting a dangerous and democratic precedent when some kind of activity of political parties and organizations is um, stopped not by the decision of the court due to some due process, but by like unilateral decision by the central authority. So again, we can say that we have no sympathy towards these parties, and they are not representing the real left at all. But the way they were outlawed, at least for the time of war, as it was declared, it's worrying, because it can be used, of course, against any other political group. You just need to point at them and say that they are somehow unpatriotic.
So let's deal with sort of the main argument that Putin has been giving for why this invasion was necessary. And then there's certain sections of the left in the United States, and I guess other places, that's have some sympathy for this argument. And essentially that the Ukrainian government, since 2014, has been launching attacks on the Russian-speaking people in Donbas, and that there was a sort of progressive character to some extent of the forces that emerged in Donbas and wanted eventually declared independence, and that over the last years since 2014, as many as 10,000 people may have been killed by the Ukrainian government forces in Donbas, and that for Russia to defend the people of Donbas, which Putin says is at least his main mission, I believe, it was necessary not just to protect the people of Donbas by having 150,000 troops on the border, but they had to actually, quote, demilitarize Ukraine. Now, I've talked to some friends in the Russian left who apparently are also split on this question. And there's a section of the Russian left that sympathizes with this need to defend Donbas. Certainly in the earlier years, some members of the Russian left even volunteered to go defend and fight in Donbas. And there was a feeling of apprehension leading up to this recent conflict that the Ukrainian government was planning some kind of assault on Donbas. So there's a lot of questions all in there, I know. So break it down, but let me just start with this. Is it not true that thousands of people were killed by Ukrainian forces in Donbas? And then two, was there a reason to believe this massive military buildup over the last year, assuming that's correct, because I don't know exactly who to believe about anything these days, but that the Americans and NATO countries had put a lot of weaponry into Ukraine, which created a legitimate sense, they argue, the Russians and some of the left, that they were in fear of an imminent attack on Donbas. So what's your take on this?
First of all, I would say that almost all words of Putin are a cynical lie, because actually, even if we start with war in Donbas, there were around 14,000 people killed. They are people killed from all sides. And actually, if we break down who killed more, so we can find that, first of all, the number of military casualties is bigger than the civilian ones. And then that, again, this view that was just like Ukrainian army unilaterally shelling the cities of Donbas. It's again not true, because it was done by both sides, and actually just a part of these people were killed by the Ukrainian forces, while still you will have a big part on like responsibility of Russia and its proxies. So actually, there was a lot of mythology, and I would say some kind of romanticizing what's happening in the Donbas. And what was particularly striking is that I would say that Kremlin didn't even try hard to paint itself as some kind of anti-fascist force, but it was bought so easily by large sections on the left, because again, if we speak about the nature of Putin's regime in Russia, it's a conservative, right-wing, authoritarian regime that is serving the interests of this nexus of what's the Russian ruling class. It's the nexus of the oligarchs, the top siloviki, that are like the people from the security services and so on, and in general bureaucrat bourgeoisie. So all this together, it constitutes the Russian ruling elite. And while Russia was and is not just an authoritarian and non-democratic state, increasingly authoritarian, especially after this invasion started, they passed a number of legislation that is really outlawing even calling this war. You can get fined, and then you can get imprisoned for long years for not calling it a special military operation, and so on. But it was also like deeply antisocial. It conducted the neoliberal reforms, like from monetization of some benefits to education reform and to pension reform, even faster than many of the countries that are seen as more neoliberal in Eastern Europe. Definitely faster than in Ukraine. So again, there is nothing progressive and nothing socialist in Russia, and the modern Russia is. It was really. It became a beacon for the far right in Europe. I would say that the majority of European far right, they were really modeling, like after this Putin system that is the best in Europe and possibly in the world. So Russia was supported by the majority of big far right parties in Europe, from Marine Le Pen in France to Hristiavgi, Golden Dawn in Greece, and first Jobbik, then Fidesz in Hungary. So really, you could say how much Putin is an anti-fascist from even how he was building up to this invasion, and his notorious warmongering speeches when he was constantly attacking the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks and Lenin for the mere existence of Ukraine as a separate republic and separate entity. And he was like clear that he is like continuing this Tsarist, imperialist, grand Russian chauvinist narratives, and he was meeting with such prominent anti-fascists as Jair Bolsonaro from Brazil and Viktor Orban from Hungary just prior to the invasion. So actually. Nothing anti-fascist at all, but they were extensively using and trying to somehow accommodate this legacy of the victory against fascism and Nazism in the Second World War as something that is legitimizing Russian like official propaganda. Though again, many in the West and in general, like abroad, they tend to associate everything that is link to the Soviet Union and to the victory in the Second World War, just to Russia. So I have to remind that it was the Soviet Union, that was a federation, at least nominally a federation of lots of republics, and only half of its population was Russian. And if we speak about, for instance, 27 million Soviet citizens who died, who perished in the horrors of the Second World War, they were not just Russians, they were Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, Tatars, people of Caucasus, Siberia, and Central Asia. And again, in the Red Army, you had also a big proportion of these people. And from a quarter to a third of Red Army and of the Soviet casualties were actually coming from the Soviet Ukraine. So it was, again, a contribution of all the peoples of the Soviet Union, not just Russia, and Russia cannot just...
Let's go back to Donbas for a second.
Yes.
I want to follow up on something. No, just a second.
Yes.
I want to ask you about something you said. If do not at least the significant number of people in areas of Donbas, if they don't want to be part of Ukraine, don't they have that right? Shouldn't the Ukrainian government, my understanding originally in 2014 and so on, the demand was a kind of federal system. Later, there was the Minsk agreement for allowing autonomy. I mean, shouldn't the Ukrainian government have actually lived up to the Minsk agreement? Wouldn't that at least helped to avoid this situation?
So again, to speak about the Donbas conflict, it was a complexity on several levels. So yes, you had like a popular sentiment behind the anti-Maidan local movement in 2014, and it was really a tragedy that the people who were protesting in, say, central and western Ukraine, and people who were protesting in eastern part of Ukraine, they were actually driven by the same problems, the same demands, but they were given like this opposing agendas in terms of some kind of identity, language, and so on. And this made it possible to teach these people against each other, though they actually a worker in Kiev, Donetsk, and Lviv, they have pretty the same grievances and pretty the same problems. So again, these questions that were artificially cracking the Ukrainian people, like the language, geopolitical orientation, some others, they were used by the local and foreign politicians for their own sake, and this brought this lack of understanding between different regions of Ukraine. It was unfortunate tragedy, but at the other levels, you also had a play of local elites who tried to local oligarchs who tried to preserve their grab, their control on these regions. And you also had some intentions of Russia that was obviously that started this. They kicked the conflict with the annexation of Crimea. That was done in well. One cannot argue that well, it's not like a real referendum when you have armed people occupying the peninsula and everything is done in a mass under the barrel of the gun, even if lots of people there were really eager to switch to Russia. And again, it was also ignoring the what the other groups in the local population, for instance, the Crimean Tatars and other peoples who have been deported in the Stalinist times, how they felt about this annexation being annexed by Russia. But okay, now we turn to Donbas. So yes, you had different views in the local population how to live afterwards. And again, it wasn't that there was overwhelming majority for breaking with Ukraine. Instead, you can even check how many people left the region due to the war, and how many of them. There were a lot of them who went to Russia, and there were a lot of them who went to other regions of Ukraine. So it was like 1.5 million IDPs, internally displaced persons, inside Ukraine. So again, obviously, these were people that were more comfortable with staying in Ukraine than going to Russia, for instance. But in any case, neither the then authority that was this post-Maidan Ukrainian authority, nor those like Russian and pro-Russian forces that tried to start like a violent confrontation, because actually there were people like Igor Strelkov, Girkin, who is like a former Russian special services guy with a monarchist worldview from this white guards nostalgia and so on. And he was a very important player in starting the military escalation in 2014 in Donbas, because he, with his unit made of Russian so-called volunteers from Russia itself, they seized a local city, Slavyansk, and then they it started this military confrontation with the Ukrainian state. So we could say that there were lots of wrong steps from the both sides. At the same time, you had a clear intention of Russia and some Russian nationals to stir up a real conflict there, and they weren't going to actually. For many of these people, the people in Kremlin and people like this adventurer Strelkov, they weren't caring about the population of Donbas. They were caring about some their own imperialist ambitions, and it was so easy for them to sacrifice the lives of the local population. And now we can say that even like really this conflict it led to a cleavage between that part of Donbas that is now controlled by these pro-Russian. Probably I'll go back on their nature of these so-called republics, and the other part is controlled by like the Ukrainian authorities, because again, in these eastern Ukrainian cities that were under Ukrainian control until they were occupied, like in these months, like in this year, you could see that there is like almost complete rejection of the Russian invaders, and the local people who are primarily Russian speaking, who used to vote primarily for the parties that are deemed as Russian. They are the same people who are now going on the streets, standing up to these Russian armed soldiers, and saying, "We were not inviting you here. This is our city, this is our land, and you are the occupiers. Go back. You say that you are liberating us, but actually we see you as fascists. You brought more war to us." And the tragedy is that probably in these days, in this we had like less than a month of this war now. That especially in Donetsk region, the same Donetsk region, when you have like the city of Mariupol, probably the number of civilian casualties is bigger than it was throughout all these 8 years of this protracted war in the Donbas. So, and this is a result of a unilateral decision made by the Russian leadership to steer a full-scale invasion against Ukraine. So
I don't want to minimize what I think is not just a violation of international law. This invasion of Ukraine are war crimes. I don't want to minimize that. But that being said, shouldn't have Ukraine have allowed a referendum in Donbas and let the people decide what their fate will be?
And yeah, so now let's get to, for instance, the issue of Minsk agreements. Yeah, so Minsk agreements have been violated again by both sides, because they were written in a way that each side was somehow it was reading in its own way. So, for instance, there was a big dispute whether the new elections, this special status for the Donbas, it is some kind of autonomy, whether it has to be inducted after the control over the border will be resumed by Ukraine or by some kind of international peacekeeping force or something like else that the sides will agree, or they first we have elections and then only we have like the returning of the this control. And again, there were arguments on both sides, and for instance that we cannot have like free and fair elections in this so-called people's republics, because again, if we speak about this Donetsk and Luhansk people's republics, they were in a way actually some kind of top-down military dictatorships. They didn't allow any kind of independent activity, independent organizations in trade unions. Even the political parties that they sanctioned, there were some political groups that had like no real entities, and the elections were again just what they claimed to be as an election. It was just made off, so it was like complete falsification. So there was no even if we speak about the problems that we have with the electoral process here, and even with Russia, still in Russia you have some controlled but parties that are not ruling, that are like oppositional. And in these regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, like there was even no kind of emulation of a proper political process. And again, how the current leadership of these so-called republics got into power through, again, just another military coup. So they had killed the previous leader in Donetsk and somehow chased off the leader in Luhansk and installed like new people who are directly members of the ruling party in Russia, the United Russia, and well, people who again have no reputation again among like local people. So the problem, yes, they were arguing that this is not, we cannot have like real elections there until we have this kind of like Russian military control over these lands. So this was what Ukraine was arguing, and Russia was arguing, but if we like close the borders and grant it back to Ukraine, then Ukraine will do some kind of I don't know, cleansing and so on. So again, both sides weren't really into,
and wasn't, given the strength of the far right in Ukraine and the even armed far right, and if I understand it correctly, with a certain strength in the armed forces, wasn't that fear of some kind of cleansing of Donbas had some merit?
So I'll finish with this one. So yeah, actually, while Ukrainian side was clearly sabotaging some parts of the political agreement of Minsk, then the Russian side was like doing lots of and pro-Russian side doing lots of violations of the security part of the Minsk agreements, and they didn't even get to like open and demilitarize what was prescribed by these agreements. All the parts of the this front, but how it's called, this line of so yeah, again, it were lots of violations from both sides, and ultimately it was the Russian side that completely destroyed Minsk by acknowledging these republics prior to the invasion. And now to get to this issue of the far right.
But hang on, let me just say,
yeah.
I got to give the counter argument here. They're saying Minsk was already dead by that point.
Minsk wasn't dead at that point, and I think that actually there was a way to many thought that actually what was this Russia's power building prior to the invasion, that many people argued that actually it's some kind of pressure to get some concessions and then to have some negotiations. But ultimately, when everyone was thinking that okay, now they will have some negotiations, then Russia went on full-scale invasion. So again, it seems as no rational decision that could really pressure for
okay,
for
let me follow up. And again, I'm going to keep saying this because I'm pushing you on issues of what Ukraine could have done, and I don't in any way want to mitigate the crimes and horror of this invasion. But there were voices in Ukraine leading up to the invasion, when the Russian forces started gathering. There were significant voices in Ukraine saying, take NATO off the table, declare neutrality now. There is the truth is, as far as I understand the politics of NATO, yes, there's that Bucharest agreement, and yes, but I think many NATO countries have made it clear that decades before Ukraine would ever be allowed into NATO, meaning probably never. Why didn't Zelenskyy just declare neutrality before the invasion?
I don't think that it was really a question about NATO. Well, actually, Zelenskyy, it was part of his political platform that he will do a referendum on such issues, including this NATO membership, though he inherited from the previous president Poroshenko, who had already, under his leadership, this membership in NATO, it was engraved in the constitution. So in some amendments that Ukraine is aspiring for Euro-Atlantic integration and so on. But actually, I think that it could be easily become a part of some kind of deal if Russian leadership did really want to contact with Zelenskyy. Because Zelenskyy, he for 2 years he was trying to get a personal, on the presidential level, personal negotiations with Putin, and probably to discuss these questions as well. However, it wasn't. He had no chance. Because the Russian side said that we are not going to speak with you, we are going to speak only with Washington. And again, this is some kind of very imperial thinking that big grand imperial powers have to decide the fate of smaller ones. And I don't think that really Zelenskyy was really sticking to this issue of NATO membership. And now he's clearly also saying that we understood back then, and we understand now that many in NATO member states, they don't want Ukraine in. So we can speak, we can negotiate on this issue. But why don't you go on these direct negotiations? Again, so I wouldn't say that it was so pressuring. I can just get back to this issue of the far right. That you put this question, and well, again, the far right is the pressuring issue for Ukraine, and we have like two dominant narratives, both of which are too simplistic. So first one is like if you read Western scholars, usually they are downplaying the importance or the influence of the far right in Ukraine, and they are rightly pointing out that electorally they are very weak. So electorally, the coalition of the major far right groups has just like 2% on election, like the last parliamentary elections, and maybe a percent and a half as a presidential election.
So they're very weak electorally.
So they are weak electorally, as they have no popularity among the population. So actually, the population is rejecting this kind of very nationalist rhetorics, and it's again quite saying that the previous presidential elections, when the incumbent President Poroshenko was defeated, he was running on a increasingly nationalist conservative platform, while Zelenskyy, he was actually an empty signifier. He had no clear program at all, but he was perceived as some kind of uniting figure who comes from this city of Kryvyi Rih, from a family of Soviet intelligentsia, some rather cosmopolitan figure, Russian-speaking, who has this message of uniting and inclusive vision of Ukraine, instead of some kind of these nationalist slogans of Poroshenko that were army, language, and face. Yeah, so this was his triad in the elections, while Zelenskyy was really speaking about like uniting all people, including bringing peace to Donbas. And actually, after his election, the ceasefire in Donbas was much more effective. So there were much less violations of the ceasefire and much less casualties, you could say. And actually, he had this mandate from the people to try and force some kind of peace deal on this. So and here we have the issue of the far right. So when they are downplaying them, they say only about the electoral results. But we understand that the real power of the far right here is not in their elections. Yes, it's in their armed resource. Because yeah, in countries like France, when some kind of Le Pen or Zemmour can get 20 and 30% of votes, or in Italy with Salvini and Liga, or some alternative for Deutschland and so on, these far right parties, they have no military wings. They obviously have no armed groups. But here we come to another view that paints Ukraine as something like synonymous to fascism. Like all Ukrainians are fascists, and the only thing you know about Ukraine is Azov battalion. The way is for many years no more a battalion but a regiment. By the way, not in the army, but in the Ministry of Interior, the National Guard. And many again spoke about this link between the original leader of Azov battalion, that was Beletsky, who hails from like real neo-Nazi groupuscule, a very small organization, and with his link to the former Minister of Interior Avakov. Yes, concentrating just on this issue. So I would say that yes, we have this huge challenge how to deal with the existence of this armed group. And now,
and how strong are they in the military?
So they have, I would say that Azov, and probably connected with some groups like it was called national militia, национальні дружини. So it's several thousand people with weapons. So compared to the entirety of Ukrainian armed forces, they are again only a small faction. but they have also this kind of again, mythology that surrounds them, that they were so efficient as defenders of Mariupol and so on and so on. So this of course boosted their legitimacy, and this, for instance, made it not so easy to if the political leadership had enough political will, for instance, to say we have to disband this battalion or regiment at this point, because it's dangerous for the citizens of Ukraine, and it's again dangerous for the public image of Ukraine. It was clear, though many politicians here seemed like completely blind and to this problem, but internationally everyone was speaking about this problem. So in order to somehow disarm it and probably disperse it, it wouldn't be so easy as well. And now is this so-called denazification intervention by Russia, it would be even less possible, because it gave them new justification for their existence and new legitimacy. Because any society, the majority of people don't want to wage war. It's this tiny group of the far right who are really eager for war, who dream about, I don't know, getting Valhalla and so on, and there's some kind of specific mindset, and they see any war as an opportunity. And you could see that it was not just this the Azov battalion and some splits from it that benefited on this war, but also other far-right groups, both on Ukrainian and on Russian side. So you could see that many international far-rights, they came to the war in Donbas, and some training camps, again on both sides, as an opportunity, yes, to take part in a war and to get some training. So you had a number of, for instance, Scandinavian or Croatian far right coming to Azov, and you had Serbian and again Scandinavian and also some other European far right coming to fight for the separatist side, the pro-Russian side. And there were, again, you mentioned that there were some Russian left who went to how they say, defend Donbas, and there is a lot of mythology, for instance, around one of these warlords in Luhansk, Mozgovoy, that he had under his command, there was even a unit with communists and so on, but under the same his command, there was a unit of far right, like the Russian neo-Nazis from Rusich and so on. And you have, of course, lots of far right among different mercenaries and different like this Wagner group, the Russian Russian government affiliated. So if you see the tattoos on some Azov and some Wagner militant, so it would be pretty the same. So these are people
one on
from
the
far right,
Ukrainian right, and one on the Russian right.
Yeah, and they are really parasiting on this war and parasiting on the tragedy of enormous number of people, while these people see this as an opportunity. And I'm afraid that with this invasion, we got, of course, that all nationalist hysteria throughout the region, it will only increase. It's increasing here, of course, as like any war brings this. It increases in Russia, and you could again, you even see Russian like again literal Nazis doing some that events with all this stuff, like the Russian National Unity, the neo-Nazi group, and lots of course dehumanization talks. And again, we were brought to an even more dangerous situation now, and I would say that what was the opportunity to so the majority of the Ukrainian society, including the majority in the Ukrainian armed forces. Again, if you listened to the current commander of Ukrainian army, Zelenskyy, he was on this previous month, going up to this invasion, he was constantly making the point that in no case Ukraine should invade Donbas and try to reintegrate it in military way. So that there is the only option is some kind of a peaceful and civic solution. So I would say that the majority of the people, they could stop these far right groups from doing some atrocities. But in the case when you have another escalation and another confrontational, more and more confrontational situation, this amplifies the voices of the extreme, and it really waters down the voices of the reasonable majority.
All right, so we're going to do a part 2 of this interview where we'll talk more about the role of the United States and NATO expansion, and the bigger picture of the geopolitics and this moment and the crisis of global capitalism, because that's really what this fundamentally is about. And I don't think we should ever stop talking about how this is a manifestation of what I would say is sort of an uneven development of capitalist countries, which is precisely what happened before World War II. I'll sort of use this in my introduction, but I'll just tease it a little bit now. You can't expect a country the size of Russia, and when I say you, I mean the United States, not to have regional power. To think that a country that size is just going to play ball and not be a regional power is ridiculous. On the other hand, if you like to sell arms, it's pretty good to try to stop them from being a regional power, and for many other reasons. None of that justifies the invasion. That being said, there's a lot of onus on US policy within the context of how global capitalism works. So we're going to talk about that in part 2. Denis, thanks very much, and thanks to everybody watching on theAnalysis.news.